A few weeks back, I asked you all to submit some questions to me and told you I would make videos to answer the top three questions. I'm getting started on those today, and I'm going to start with the top question, which was submitted by Radical Hamster. That's kind of a great name, by the way. And the question was, why do I feel the urge to self-sabotage when I'm finally getting better? And why does getting better feel so uncomfortable? I'm glad that you put this into two parts. I would have if you didn't, so thanks for doing that for me. The first part of this question I want to address is, are you actually self sabotaging? You may think you know the answer, but self sabotage, I think, is one of the most overused phrases in mental health. And I have seen so many therapists and clinicians and professionals apply this term to people who I very much do not believe are self sabotaging. I think it's almost become like a blanket term for anyone who has an unsuccessful attempt at change or improvement. So let me break this down a little bit for you and see if you're actually self sabotaging. The term self sabotage implies a conscious and intentional decision to halt or undo your own progress. If that's not what you're doing, you're not self sabotaging. Don't assume that just because you tried something and it didn't work, that you have self sabotaged. I'm going to name the top three reasons I see people struggle to sustain positive changes that they have made. And self sabotage, just so you know, not in my top three. The number one I see, and I think it's by like a pretty big degree, is you over monitored your own symptoms and accidentally triggered a self-fulfilling prophecy. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but what I mean by that is when we're working on some certain symptom, depression, anxiety, anhedonia, residual trauma symptoms, whatever we're working on, when we make some change that we hope will reduce those symptoms, we often pay very, very close attention to those symptoms because we're trying to see if they change or not, which makes sense. But what I see happen so often in this journey is that people pay so close attention to those symptoms that when they notice any level of them at all, they kind of panic and assume that their intervention was not working and they blow it out of proportion, which actually causes it to grow. Let me give two examples of this. See this all the time with panic attacks. So let's say you're struggling with panic attacks at the grocery store, for example, and you've learned this new therapy technique and you think this therapy technique might help stop the panic attacks. And you're kind of excited to try it out, excited and scared at the same time, right? So you go to the store and you're doing, maybe it's a cognitive technique or a breath work technique or whatever, and you're doing it. And while you're doing it, you're trying to look for any signs that you're about to have a panic attack because you want to make sure that this is going to work. And you notice at some point some little thing, maybe it's like a quick jolt of a nervous thought, or your heart rate goes up a little bit, or your breath just feels a little short, and you think, oh, there it is. There's the first sign. I'm starting to, it's going to go downhill. It's not going to work. And your entire being starts to spiral in that direction. And you end up having a panic attack, maybe not because you were in the grocery store, but because you told yourself your attempt was failing and you were going to have a panic attack because you picked up on some maybe pretty minuscule little thing that might have just been a normal blip on the anxiety radar. Or let's say it's depression. Let's say that you've had a couple good days because you've tried something, maybe picked up a new hobby or like started a new, joined a new social group or something like that. You made this big, exciting change and you're feeling kind of optimistic about it. And at first it's going really well. And then on like day three or day four, you notice a little bit of the sadness and the emptiness there again. And you think, oh man, I don't know. I feel it coming back. I don't know if this is going to work. And you start to really fixate on that feeling inside of you. And what happens is the more you fixate it on it and the more you focus on it, it kind of grows and grows and grows because it's like you're putting a spotlight on it. And eventually you are back where you started. But that may not have been the inevitable endpoint of the changes you made as it seemed. It may have been a result of your own over focusing on the symptoms. I would not regard that as self sabotage because that is not something you're doing on purpose. That's more like a bad habit that you're probably going to need some help to break. Second reason I see people make some good changes but struggle to sustain them is simply because the changes they tried to make were either too big or were done too quickly. And I guess that's kind of the same thing, really. But this journey gets really frustrating, and I know that. And you get so sick of being some certain way, and sometimes you sort of do the like cold turkey, turn your life upside down kind of thing. Like maybe you haven't had work in 2 years, let's say, and you're just so sick of like feeling like you don't have a purpose occupationally and not having a steady income. And you have this one day where you get this burst of like motivation slash frustration slash rage, and you like anger apply to 20 jobs and you get one. And it's a full-time job and you haven't worked in 2 years. And you go and you work and you go from working 0 hours a week to 40, like literally overnight, and you do it for a couple of weeks and you burn yourself out. Well, that's a huge change. And ideally, big changes in life should happen gradually and with a stepwise approach. It is very understandable that when you make these really rapid changes, it's hard to stick with them. You can like bootstrap yourself through it and force yourself to do something really hard with willpower for some certain amount of time. I feel like the average is about 2 weeks. And once you run out of that willpower, you realize that you haven't actually made enough structural or foundational lifestyle changes to support this big new like mental and cognitive expense that you've added, and it all falls apart. I would also not consider that self-sabotage. I would consider it like poor strategy. I'm not trying to be mean. It's like that just doesn't usually work, and it doesn't usually work for anybody, and it's not intentional and it's not on purpose. So, in my mind, that's not self-sabotage. And the third is that you simply experience a setback. Maybe that setback is external. Maybe you lose a relationship to a breakup or death, or you just face some unexpected new challenge, like a new medical condition, or just something bad happens in your life that causes a setback. Sometimes the setbacks are internal, especially if you have a cyclical diagnosis. If you have major depressive disorder, if you have bipolar disorder, or to some degree even PTSD. PTSD is not cyclical in the sense that it's episodic, but your symptoms can vary tremendously depending on frequency and severity of triggers you're experiencing. So you can feel and look and function really different from one day to the next. So there are really pronounced ups and downs in your symptoms. Setbacks, unfortunately, are a part of this journey, whether internally or externally triggered. And not every setback is an episode of self-sabotage unless you purposely like sought it out or did it to yourself. So those are three examples of things that I would encourage you not to classify as self-sabotage because I think that is very blaming and judgmental, and I don't think it's an appropriate label for those types of setbacks. Now, let's say you've listened this far and you're like, nope, hey, like legit, I self-sabotage it. I am doing it to myself. I am doing it on purpose. I know I'm doing it. Why am I doing it? Please help. I'm sure that some people do self-sabotage. So let's talk about that now. Why does getting better feel so uncomfortable? Because I think that's the key. I think that Radical Hamster like didn't explicitly say it, but tied those two things together. That probably the reason we self-sabotage is because feeling better actually feels like terrifying or uncomfortable. Two things happen to us when we've been kind of like at the bottom of the barrel in life for a long time. The first is simply that you get used to it. It becomes a predictable and in a weird way, in a very dysfunctional way, almost a comfortable sensation. It's a little bit like if you've never faced food insecurity, if you've like always had food, which I have, I've never faced food insecurity. So when I get hungry, it's kind of a crisis because I'm not used to having to deal with that feeling. I don't go a long time without eating very often. I love food. I love to eat. So if some certain circumstance happens, such as, and this is a true story, me being at a wedding and not getting to eat lunch until 2 o'clock, I am liable to, sorry, in-laws and wife, cut the buffet line because I'm suffering, or at least I think I'm suffering. Because that's not something I'm used to having to deal with. But if I were someone who had faced a lot of food insecurity, being hungry stops being like a shock to your system after a while. And eventually, being hungry just feels normal. You're always hungry. You get used to it. So now take that framework, take that sentence, but take the word hungry out and put in a word like lonely or unsatisfied or miserable or bed rotting. You can put almost any word in there and the logic still applies. The first time you hit rock bottom, it's terrible. And it's always terrible, but the shock factor goes away after a while. And eventually you get used to it and you're like, I can live like this if I have to. I don't like it, but I can do it. I've been doing it for however long, and it just becomes your new normal. I know that I kind of hate that saying sometimes, but it loses its shock value and it loses its fear, and there almost does become a dysfunctional level of comfort with it. Going along with that, the second thing that happens is that we lose trust in ourselves and our ability to sustain anything good. And having something good that we could lose, like a relationship or a job or a safe and stable place to live, actually feels really threatening and scary because we don't trust that we can keep it. And we live in near constant fear and stress about when am I going to screw this up? I can't have good things. I can't do good things. I can't make people happy. When am I going to do something that's going to pull the rug out from under me and put me back where I was before? Except this time, since I was up for a little bit, that shock value of falling that I didn't feel because I was at the bottom for a long time. Not only am I going to go back there, I'm going to get that shock again because it's gonna happen suddenly and unexpectedly, and there's going to be loss involved, and that loss hurts almost more, I think, than being in that low place. And so when we feel that this screw up or this failure is inevitable, sometimes we do the you can't fire me, I quit thing. And we basically try to beat life to the punch and say, no, before you, life, surprise me with this sudden, unexpected change. I'm just going to do it to myself. And that way, at least the shock factor and the surprise factor go down a little bit because I know when it's going to happen. And I get a little bit of a sense of control over it because I'm the one that caused it. And I did it intentionally rather than unintentionally. It also, this one I don't know if is true for everyone, but it also kind of gives us an excuse. Like maybe I could have made that relationship work. Maybe I could have made that career work. I chose not to. So it lets you maintain like this fantasy that you could have had it long term. Whereas if you tried your absolute best and it still didn't work out, you can't even hold on to that fantasy anymore. If that is true for you, if you're still with me and you're like, yep, it is self sabotage. That is definitely what I'm doing. How do I stop? I don't have an easy answer for you, but I do have an answer. Every thought that ever happens in your head is actually just a theory or a projection. I know that they are not phrased that way. If you have a relationship and you haven't had a relationship in a while, and your brain says, I'm going to screw this up, I'm going to ruin it, they're going to hate me, I'm going to do something wrong, it's not phrased as a theory. It's phrased as a factual, 100% true statement, but it isn't. I know it feels like it is. I know it seems like it is. I know it sounds like it is. And I know you feel like you have evidence to support that idea that it is. It's a theory. And every theory is testable. These negative thoughts and negative statements and negative predictions are driven by negative belief systems. A belief system is what we think is a rule about the world. I'm unlovable is a belief system. And if I believe that I'm unlovable, I will probably believe that every relationship I'm in will eventually be unsuccessful because they will find out that I'm unlovable and they won't love me. Boom, the end. But you have to test your theory. And the only way you can ever change a belief system is if you're in a situation where it is at least possible for you to be wrong. If you believe that you are unlovable and you isolate yourself in your room for the rest of your life, you will be, air quotes, right, because you will never be in a situation where you could possibly be wrong. That would be like me saying I could never be a successful YouTuber and therefore never make a YouTube video and then someday die being like, ha, see, I was right. I couldn't make a YouTube. I couldn't be a successful YouTuber. Well, I wasn't in a situation where that even could have happened. So I never got the opportunity or never gave myself the opportunity really to test my theory and see if it was correct. If you think that you can never maintain employment, and so you do not apply for jobs or don't show up to the interviews or don't accept the jobs that get offered to you, it's impossible for you to be wrong. You're proving yourself right at every turn, but that doesn't actually mean that you're right. It means you're engineering your own life in a way that supports your maladaptive belief systems. So if you really want to work on this, be a good scientist, test your data by putting yourself in situations where it is at least theoretically possible for you to gather information that contradicts your theory. Because a good scientist doesn't only look for information that supports their theory, they also look for contradictory information, otherwise, they're biased. And if you are gathering data, I don't know why I'm being so judgmental sounding right now, but I really want you to stop self sabotaging. If you are gathering data and you self sabotage the relationship, the job, the living situation, or whatever, that data is contaminated. You tampered with the data and your results are invalid because you don't actually know what would have happened if you hadn't messed with it. So don't mess with it on purpose and see what happens. Maybe you get a different outcome. Maybe that changes your whole outlook. See you guys next time.